the drugs that we're talking about here are not for bodybuilders. Testosterone, growth hormone, insulin, telmisartan, down the list we go, metformin. Many of the drugs that I advocate are in lifetime human clinical use. This is a conversation not about human use. This is not a conversation about lifetime use. This is a conversation about dosage over time.
Is bodybuilding about selfies, steroids, magazines, and muscles? How do I become a successful pro bodybuilder or fitness competitor? Where do I even start if I'm new? And the biggest question of all, what are the judges looking for anyway? Even today with the internet, many people first discover bodybuilding by word of mouth. The lack of regulation has caused a boom of unqualified coaches, scattered info, biased advice, dangerous protocols, and imposing trends that are a hot mess. After 20 years in the business, I have seen it all. Week after week, I'm going to talk about taboo topics that get swept under the rug, provide you tips and strategies to gain a competitive edge and stand out on stage in any division or federation. I'm going to answer all the burning industry questions without the bias. I have competed across 6 federations, earned pro status in 3, and judged in 2. I've coached posing and choreography for men and women in all federations and divisions. I know just how much competing means to you. I'm your host, Michelle Welcome, and you are listening to the Everything Else in Bodybuilding podcast. Be sure to download your free guide, 5 Things Every Bodybuilder and Fitness Competitor Needs to Know Before Your Next Show at eeinbb.com. That's www.eeinbb.com. Welcome back to the Everything Else in Bodybuilding podcast. I'm your host, Michelle Welcome. I have my co-host, Vasilios Mitropoulos.
Soon to be full-time host if I go my way.
And today we're going to be talking about why 90% of PED models are dangerous and inaccurate. And our guest today is an expert on this subject who has a massive knowledge on PEDs, hormones, metabolism control, and vitamins. He ruffles a lot of feathers in the fitness and bodybuilding industry because he calls out highly influential and well-known people on their lack of facts and the quality of information they share about PEDs and how it affects physiology. And we're going to myth bust some of those protocols today. But first, Victor, can you share, this is Victor Black, by the way, can you share a little bit about you and how you came from being a really smart guy? I believe you're an engineering background. How did you go from being a really smart guy to offering to be on video calls with healthcare providers to come up with PED and IED protocols?
Firstly, thank you for the invitation to the podcast, guys. I very much appreciate any opportunity we can to help to educate and to influence what I refer to as the tribe. I appreciate that. So thank you very much. Yeah, so
definitely.
So let me just begin by saying, so I'm clear up front, I have no academic credentials or qualifications in this discipline whatsoever. Yeah, I don't even hold a personal training certificate. I'm very much what I consider to be a recreational user of training, nutritional principles, of performance-enhancing drug principles. I've been training for 40 years now. I'm 55 years old. And I was just incredibly frustrated by the lack of quality, what I would call evidence-based content that was available for enhancement practices. Most people today would be familiar with guys like Dr. Brad Schoenfeld and many others. I hesitate to name one individual because there's many that have done remarkable things for the natural training community and the enhanced training community, to be fair, but they tend to focus on training principles and nutritional principles and supplementational principles. And they've called out a lot of the we could call it bro science, we could call it scams, you could call it however you want to position it. They've called a lot of people out saying, look, there's no quality evidence to support that practice over there. Right? A simple example to get us rolling is most people would be familiar with the concept that today really nobody's pushing BCAAs anymore. And they were hugely popular, 10 years ago. That was a multi-million-dollar must-have supplement for almost everybody at one point, BCAAs. Today is, we realize that, well, as long as you're taking enough protein intake, those 3 amino acids are really, maybe, but it's a very small maybe. So we've gone from a must-have thing that you have to spend your money on, otherwise you won't be successful. And that's kind of how it was pitched by some of the supplement companies, to a highly questionable practice that very few people follow today, if that makes sense. I'm attempting in my own way to do the same thing for the enhanced community, to take a lot of the misunderstandings, a lot of the mythologies, and simply provide credible evidence-based information for people to make decisions about whether or not that's a rational model to follow. Now, if you know much about the evidence-based community, there's a lot of things that they broke. There's a lot of myths that they broke open in that process and upset a lot of individuals and ruffled a few feathers. But, it's fair to say that the misunderstandings, the lack of communication, the lack of quality evidence is even more profound in the evidence-based community. In the enhanced community. Yeah. So everything you said is completely true. The reality is, though, I'm not a PhD. I don't hold academic credentials. Yes, I have a background in military engineering. I'm a weapons engineer, so I have, a technical background, as it were, per se, but not in this discipline. So I appreciate the opportunity to come on the show and talk about some of these things.
Yeah.
So excited to have you, Victor.
Awesome. That's great. So, just quick question then. So if you go from what your background is, did you get involved literally just from what? From lack of wanting to know or wanting to do, or what exactly?
Just from doing. A classic example would be 20 years. I trained and competed for 20 years as a natural. I wasn't terribly good, but I certainly competed at the amateur level, natural bodybuilding. Yeah. After 20 years, I decided to open the enhanced door. I literally just felt that I was putting in a tremendous amount of time and effort into training, practices and not really making any progress. And anyone that's in this domain can relate to that story. You literally reach this point of diminishing returns where returns are so small, you feel like you're not making any progress at all. Yeah. When I decided to educate myself about these things, I went out and did what I thought was the right thing, and that is bought a copy of every, high-profile book on the market and began reading. Yeah, this was, I won't say pre-internet, but it was right at the cusp of the internet becoming the communications medium. Yeah, 20 years ago. That's kind of, I don't know how old Google is, but you can picture the time frame I'm talking about. And very quickly, when I started reading these books with the engineer's eye, I started to realize that there were, disconnects between what these books were saying and what makes sense. A simple example, since I ruffle a lot of feathers, I bought a copy of Bill Llewellyn's book, the Anabolics series of books that he's produced. He's in his 12th variant today. And immediately when you start reading it, you realize that there's information in that any logical mind is going to start questioning. A simple example would be, and I've used this many times, a lot of people believe that Trenbolone is a very androgenic compound. It has an anabolic to androgenic rating that people quote as 500 to 500. Most people have heard that at some point in time. But then in clinical practice, this was a drug that was given to women. So just those two simple facts. If you know nothing else about anabolic steroids, you have to go, well, why did they do that? That doesn't make any sense. The whole point of anabolic steroids was to create a class of compounds that retain the potential therapeutic benefits of testosterone so we could give it to women, yeah, but at lower levels of virilization outcomes. So it doesn't, why would they give a drug that was 5 times more androgenic to testosterone? So the moment then you start to ask that single question, you realize, well, it's not. Trenbolone is a steroid of SARMs. And we've known this for, since the beginning of time. So there's a disconnect between what was being presented to our tribe in books like Anabolic Steroid Guides and something like and what the body of clinical literature represents in clinical practice. So the moment I started doing...
Real quick about those books. Now, were the people that published those books, were they PhDs? What kind of credentials did they have to be providing this information to the public?
I think it's fair to say that over the years, we have had influences in our community that range from academically credentialed to simply bros. There's been a range, yeah, but there has been one common thread amongst them, and that is it's almost been like a Chinese whisper. Someone at some point said something, and that got drawn into the next iteration of the materials, and it became copy paste. Yeah. So if you go looking, the obvious question is, well, Bill must have got that from somewhere. Where did he get that information from? And there was a book published in 1967 by, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, Paul Vieta, I believe it was basically, that nominated that as being the anabolic potential and the androgenic potential of those drugs. So it's in Bill's book, but it's in a preceding book as well. So it's kind of just come down the line, as it were. So to answer your question, I think there's been a spread of different skill sets, but the one thing that we haven't done a great job on is fact checking.
Yeah, 100%. You know, Victor, that leads me right to one of my first questions was, and you somewhat answered this. Really, it was, you know, the transfer of information and the evolution of information from books to internet. But in just for anybody listening who's never heard anything in my background in bodybuilding fitness has been by osmosis through my wife here for the last 8 years. Obviously, as a teenager, you see magazines, so on and so forth. You're in and out of gyms doing whatever. But I'm a musician by trade first. So fitness came second in my life. Now it's full time. I've been obviously involved in it for a long time, but my information and perception of everything that's been presented to me is of mixed use, both from the layman's, like, what the hell is this? What does that even mean? What's an anabolic? I have no idea. All the way to like, okay, now I'm starting to understand some of the names and uses, natural versus not, federation, so on and so forth. But a lot of the questions for me always stem from like, how did we go from bodybuilding being on magazines and just cool to like now PED use in teenagers, and what's safe, what's not? Where do you draw the line? Mm-hmm. Where do you even start? Like, where do you get this evidence-based information? You are in that murky area of like published information of what is or isn't. Like you just mentioned something about one particular drug and how that drug was used for women. And that's just mind blowing to me. Like, who woke up one day and said, hey, this particular substance could be good in some form or another if we use it in this direction towards this particular species to help them with this thing. We went from one person's idea to teenagers wanting to look good on Instagram and everyone getting jacked all the time and all different protocols. Like where and how did all that come about?
There is a thread if you follow it. One of the great ironies here is very often you'll hear people say things like, there's no good information for women when it comes to performance enhancing drugs. I don't know whether you agree with that, but it's something that people say, yeah, that most of the information is biased towards men. Now, the interesting thing is, but if you actually look at human clinical practice of these drugs, because the origin point for these drugs is, well, these drugs weren't developed for bodybuilders or powerlifters or strength athletes. They were developed for disease state treatment. And most of the drugs that we use in bodybuilding today, ironically, were actually developed to meet the needs of women and the elderly, what we would call the androgen sensitive. In other words, we had the drug testosterone. We've been synthesizing testosterone since the 1930s, but we understood when we gave it to women for therapeutic benefit, we realized the therapeutic benefits, but also with those benefits came the specter of virilization or masculinization. So really the development of anabolic steroids, if we start with the hormone testosterone and then begin with derivatives of testosterone, the force that drove that was the ability to give women, the elderly, and even children a drug that carried the therapeutic benefits of testosterone, but at lower threat of virilization. So kind of the thread that you're after there is saying, okay, so there were people that realized there were drugs being developed, that provided, increases in protein accretion, for example, increases in force production, in clinical benefit. Can we as recreational athletes and professional athletes in some cases, I would dare to beg that it began with the professional athletes. They're always looking for an edge, and they always have, right? Started dipping into that resource pool. But what we didn't carry with it was the awareness of how we apply these drugs. And again, the first big caveat is, how is it possible that in our tribe, in our recreational user community tribe, in our professional user community tribe, we can say things like, there's no really good quality educational content for women when these are drugs developed for women. That there's a disconnect there, like something must be wrong. And the hard reality is, well, the information is there, but nobody's ever bothered to translate it correctly from, the what we call the evidence-based community, the clinical application community into our tribe. No one's bothered to pull that with you. I'll give you a simple example. There's been a rise of the drug called SARMs, selective androgen receptor modulators, over the last decade or so. It's actually now on its decline, in part because of the work that I've been doing to explain this. But the whole point of SARMs was never to solve a problem that men face. Men have very little to fear from the application of anabolic steroids, understanding that so steroids were developed to offset some of the negative consequence of use for women of testosterone, understood. There was really never a successful complete removal of androgenic potential from steroids. And so the current generation of research is in an area called SARMs, where they're trying to retain the anabolic potential of testosterone, but remove that very last vestige of androgenic impact that comes with anabolic steroids. It was massively reduced, but there's still some there. So the next step, the whole folly of men following down that path is silly, because you understand, so you're chasing a solution to a problem that does not exist in men. Like it's when you sit there and think about it. So here's a drug yet again being developed for the androgen sensitive. They're trying to solve this list of problems, and yet none of those problems apply to healthy young men. Why are we even down that path? It makes no rational sense when you understand what is actually happening, the disconnect between our tribal behaviors and clinical practice or research practice. I don't know whether that answers your... Go ahead, sorry.
And real quick, can you explain to the audience, for the people that don't know, the new people that are listening to this and they're like SARMs, they're listening to all the, these words that are being shared, and specifically androgenic and anabolic. Can you explain on a basic level, what do those two things mean?
Yeah, so I'll keep it real layman's term. If I need to lift it up a level, then please tell me. I would broadly say we would use the term androgenic to describe any outcome that we would associate with masculine or male sexual traits. Yeah. So if you looked at anabolic and you associate that with, in layman's term, hypertrophic outcomes, an increase in protein accretion, many benefits on bone and other tissue. But if you said, okay, so there's a splitting of the discussion here. Anabolic will set aside as being contributing to hypertrophic outcomes, the increase of protein tissue, yeah, and androgenic as in contributing to male secondary sexual characteristics. Does it make sense, that language? Yeah.
100%. I've heard you mention in an episode actually today, something that I'm unaware of really till you, which is what you call different metabolic pathways. And kind of like the outsider layman, I hear the word anabolic or steroid thrown around all the time, right? But I've never heard these different metabolic pathways before. And you mentioned, doing things simultaneously, and this will lead into the Black Basal Model that I believe we're going to talk about a little bit. But you mentioned using all these pathways in synchronicity to do things potentially in a safe way. So I'm very interested in what that is and how it all kind of came about and what it all means.
So you have to understand the historical use of performance-enhancing drugs to understand what the future holds. So what we used to do in the past was we would historically start with oral steroids. Now, the reason we would start with oral steroids was there was a certain phobia to self-administration of injectable drugs. One can understand that. I'm empathetic to that. So everybody historically, when I started with drugs like Dianabol or, anavar, drugs that you took in a tablet form. Yeah. And then typically the escalation process was from oral anabolic steroids to injectable anabolic steroids was a journey people went on. You did that for a little while, then you wanted to increase the dose, you went to injectable. Eventually what happened was people escalated the dose of anabolic steroids to the point where they reached the point of what we would call toxicity. They were taking so much of the drug that they realized they simply couldn't take any more anabolic steroids. And the dosages, it's fair to say, have grown and grown and grown and grown. And eventually anyone with some common sense went, that's as far as I'm comfortable pushing. And then what they would typically do is ask the question, what other classes of drugs exist that I could put with this that don't play a more toxic pressure on that pathway, but contribute something to the overall goal of hypertrophic outcome? The obvious one that people typically stepped into on a second basis was recombinant human growth hormone. Yeah. And then they would do that. They would raise the growth hormone dose alongside the highest amount of androgens they could take until, for most people, they ran out of money. It wasn't so much a toxic discussion about growth hormone, but a financial one. And when they spent their budget, they would move to the next class of drug and the next class of drug. Does that make sense, that kind of linear progression? That's just how it was done for 20 years.
Yeah, 100%.
And, when someone who was an amateur, someone that was like what you call a recreational user of these drugs, spoke to someone that was more elite, and they said, I'm thinking about growth hormone, literally that was like Shun saying, you're only a recreational user. You're simply, not a candidate for something like growth hormone. But the great irony, of course, is, well, growth hormone's use is more limited by what you can afford rather than toxic outcome. So that conversation doesn't really make any sense. Yes, I could understand if someone said, look, I have financial constraints. Okay, I get it. But let's assume you're dealing with someone in their 50s and money is no longer, they're at the point in their life they can afford discretionary income choices. Yeah. Why would you steer them away from growth hormone? It doesn't really make any sense. The idea of putting some steroids and some growth hormone together, plausibly you end up with a 1 + 1 = 3 outcome, but at lower toxic consequence of the first drug if you introduce it earlier in the process. Does it make sense?
Yes.
Yeah? So the whole premise here is, rather than starting on pathway number 1, anabolic steroids via the androgen receptor, and increasing the dose until you reach a point of toxicity, and then going to the next class of drug, and then the next class of drug, or the next class of drug, the Black Basal Model is simply based on, why don't we very moderately modulate every metabolic pathway that we can easily and safely, rather than pushing too hard on any one? It's a very simple premise, yeah? And the idea being is, instead of creating a pool of toxicity around one of these pathways, we just basically spread the load, spread the work, as it were, across multiple metabolic pathways, restricting ourselves to drugs that offer us the most benign or the gentlest systemic stress outcome that we can create over a lifetime of use. It's completely the opposite way that things were done before. Before, you started with 1, turned the volume up to 10, start with the next pathway, turn the volume up to 10, start with the next pathway, turn the volume. I'm simply saying we should be starting earlier. Now, the criticism, the feedback to that model is very simple and very fair. But Victor, that's more moving parts and more to learn and plausibly more expensive. And I wear that. Yeah. But I think it's fair to say, but cost shouldn't drive all of our decisions.
Well, health has a cost to it. Also, what percentage of people do you think are in the other model, not your model, the basal model? What do you think? How many of the bodybuilders out there are following just that protocol? Were they blasting number 1 and then going on to the next one? GH, it seemed like that was number 2.
That's just the way it's done.
Is it like a 99%, except for like the people that you work with?
One of the things I would argue, the reason I've ruffled so many feathers before, if you took someone that entered the debate about, say, volume versus intensity in training today, yeah, to understand, but the moment they open their mouth to speak, they have millions of advocates for what they're talking about, because there's millions of people that lean into volume, or there's millions of people that lean into the historical use of intensity. I would argue the moment I started speaking 7 years ago, I was the only person in the world doing this model, me and my clients. Yeah. So it was not 99%, it was 99.9% of the community. That's just what we did. We started with anabolic steroids. We took that to its logical toxic outcome as much as we could tolerate on a blast cruise model, until we saw, this is the whole premise of cycling. If you've heard the term anabolic steroid cycle, yeah, the entire premise is, we're going to use so much anabolic steroids that ultimately we know in our back of our mind that this is not sustainable for years. You get a certain number of weeks. Concern over toxicity means you stop and you back off and you give yourself a break and you push on. That's the very definition of anabolic steroid cycling. You know what you're doing is unsustainable. Yeah. What I'm proposing is we try to figure out, so let's work out how much drugs that we can take on a sustainable basis and apply those stimuli towards the outcome. And then let's closely monitor our progress along the way and figure out whether we can live on that amount of drugs. Because you have to understand, the drugs that we're talking about here are not for bodybuilders. Testosterone, growth hormone, insulin, telmisartan, down the list we go, metformin. Many of the drugs that I advocate are in lifetime human clinical use. This is a conversation not about human use. This is not a conversation about lifetime use. This is a conversation about dosage over time.
Interesting. Okay. And how does it differ from men to women, the protocols?
So the interesting thing is women are a completely different conversation to men. And the problem is, it's fair to say, I don't know, you don't need to agree with me, but in my opinion, most male coaches tend to treat women as little men. They tend to approach it as saying, look, you're going to do everything my male athletes do, but you're going to do like, we're just going to scale it down because you're a woman, sort of thing. And I would argue that's the first flaw in the model. We need to approach female training, and we need to approach female nutrition, and we need to approach female enhancement practices with a blank piece of paper. A classic example would be women are so exquisitely sensitive to growth promotion agents that the reality is that we're giving them dosages that don't cause toxic outcome. A simple example: if we just limit the conversation to androgens, anabolic steroids, right? There is a group of women biologically born as women that wish, through whatever circumstance, to be identified as the male gender, the transgender community. Okay. So the Endocrinologist Society are more than happy to give that cohort of women enough androgens so they physically identify as men to someone walking down the street. They sound like a man. They have physical characteristics of man. Of course, biologically, they retain the fact that they were born a female, right? So the concern isn't about organ health. This is a conversation with women about virilization. The conversation about men is about organ health, brain health, kidney health, heart health. The conversation about women, because the dosage is so low, are nothing to do with those things. It's a conversation about, and the best evidence I can give you, you do realize that there's an entire cohort of women effectively purposely trying to induce the problems that female bodybuilders are trying to remove. What a fascinating what a fascinating cohort. This is a classic example. When I introduced the concept of wanting to talk about transgender therapies and using transgender as a data set that we can look at, say, look, imagine if you had a group of men that were taking that so much drugs that they were deliberately trying to induce the side effects that I would be all over that. What does it say? What does it say? And yet the very fact that I said it upset thousands of women because they felt offended by the fact they didn't identify themselves as being transgender. This is just immature.
Well, it's an interesting thing that you bring up, because I do want to make the point. You mentioned, in fact, I'd love for you to share, what is the average dose given to a transgender female on a weekly basis in order to elicit those side effects, in order for them to transform from biological male to female? If you can share, or sorry, my bad, the other direction. Biological male to female to male.
It's fair to say that there has always been a range of drug protocols. Yeah. What I would like to focus on, so what's the minimum amount? At what point does this discussion begin? And it's 50 milligrams of testosterone a week is really what we would say. From 50 up is what is used in clinical practice. So if you have a woman that's using, again, if you look at let's just use some threshold. So testosterone replacement therapy for women, a vastly different practice from transgender treatment. Like, it's not even in the same category, but it's on a spectrum, if you understand the conversation. So testosterone replacement therapy begins at 3 milligrams per week, 3, okay? And transgender begins at 50, okay? So somewhere in between there is a conversation that we can have about enhancement practices. Obviously, we want to lean as closely as we can towards replacement practice rather than we can about a transgender. But the point I was making is, very often, like you said at the beginning, I have upset people. Why? I don't understand for the life of me why the female enhancement community hasn't been all over this literature for 50 years. It's the perfect data set for us to discuss, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to create an outcome in women that doesn't cause concern over health, but we've gone too far with the virilization outcome. So what can we learn from that? And what I would argue is, well, we don't want to do this, and this. These are the takeaways from that process. But just discussing it offends a tremendous number of people.
Well, I think some of that has to do with a lot of women
unfortunately, again, this is word of mouth from me. I've been in the industry for 20 years myself, competing, coaching, and judging. So I've seen a lot, talked a lot, heard a lot. And there's a lot of women who didn't even know that was going to happen to them. They're listening to a coach and they're trusting this coach who's got all these trophies and, showing all these amazing transformations. And they're just following their coach. And you'd be surprised how many women have reached out to me privately and said, hey, this is the protocol that I got from my coach. What do you think? And I'm like, I think you need to start exercising first.
Correct. And this goes back to the point whereby I am very outspoken, where I try to hold historical educators to account. That statement comes from Dan Duchaine. Unashamedly, Dan Duchaine was of the attitude that virilization only happens through the application of testosterone. You cannot virilize a woman through anabolic steroids. This is plainly just not correct. Do you know what I mean? But it's what he taught. That's in black and white in his books. Like, if you see a woman in the locker room and she has a hairy back, you know what she's taking. She's taking testosterone. These are his words. In my opinion, people that say things like this must be held to account. There's no clinical evidence to support that statement at all on any level. Any time in history have we had that philosophy. But someone in the bodybuilding community has taken that takeaway from the clinical literature. So yes, the information that women have very often, I find, when you start talking to people, is they've never heard these things before. They didn't realize, when we talk about testosterone levels, we have 3 or 4 fabulous sets of data. What about women that suffer from hyperandrogenic outcomes as a result of PCOS? Very interesting. I would like to know about that. What about the application of anabolic steroids for clinical practice like estrogen-mediated breast cancer? Very nice. I would like to know about that. What about the elevation of testosterone during pregnancy? I'm sure you're aware, during the 3rd trimester of pregnancy, women often reach testosterone levels approaching that of male physiological range. It's very interesting. Let's talk about that. This is not how we've approached the application of knowledge in our tribe historically. In other words, what bodies of evidence do we have to discuss about elevated androgen state, not in bodybuilders, but in other people that we can study and we can draw takeaways from? We've just never approached the subject like that.
It's interesting. It's interesting. It kind of brings back to what I was saying, like, how did we go from, magazines and bodybuilding and just positive influence over image to where we are today? And we're talking about identity crossover in different tribes, as you were mentioning, between men and female and in between and everything in between. So what's interesting to me is what you mentioned with health, how women, biologically born women, deal with, virilization versus men dealing with organ issues. I would want to have the discussion around, like, who makes the decisions of what's good, what's right, what's wrong? Ultimately, this is all about identity, right? We're trying to identify, we're trying to grow into the image of which we see ourselves. And that's becoming skewed in so many different ways. And so how does that affect, why is it okay for a biological woman to take a certain amount of whatever to get to a certain image, and in that image potentially damage her body or now his body, it be okay or not okay? And vice versa for men. Why is it okay for men to be in a direction where we can do something just for image, but it's more manly, it's more acceptable? Ultimately, are we doing more damage? Is there any safe outcome in any way? Are we developing a healthier species overall? Can we live for 200 years if we find the right formula? You know what I mean? It's real.
This is at the heart of what I'm trying to teach. So there's a couple of threads. Let me pull on a couple of threads. The first one is, I would argue that such a thing as supernatural man plausibly does exist. So we're taking an individual that does not today enjoy an endocrine profile of what is plausibly possible in the human species and giving it to them artificially. That's a very interesting conversation, because it becomes plausibly safer for you than natural bodybuilding. Anyone that's been in natural bodybuilding knows the stress that you create in climbing onto the stage with that type of body composition. It's not a healthy pursuit. Somewhere in the middle ground, whereby even if you said, look, this is the endocrine profile of a natural bodybuilder standing on a stage, if we did nothing more than took these crashes and these highs and these lows, where we have basically these hormones at all-time low levels, things like cortisol spiking through the roof, and we flatten these lines out and simply use enough of the drugs to bring them back to baseline where they began the journey, right? That plausibly is safer. Yeah.
Isn't that TRT?
Well, it's TRT, but understanding that testosterone is only one of 13 metabolic pathways. Yeah. So if you took the TRT approach and said, right, I'm going to use TRT as the benchmark, I go, all right, all we need to now do is extend the conversation out 13 times. Let's talk about thyroid. Let's talk about the IGF-1 axis. Let's talk about all of the endocrine axes that we have the capacity to modulate with human-approved human use drugs.
Victor, would you say that what you're saying, that these 13 metabolic pathways, ultimately you're looking to develop something like a new vitamin protocol?
That's what the Black Basic Model is. We are moderately modulating those pathways today through the application of drugs. It's not that the drugs come in a blended compound, like there's testosterone, there's growth hormone, there's these drugs. Yeah,
it's individualized.
Yeah, each pathway is modulated by a specific compound, and there's no real way to mush them together. That's not practical, at least today.
Is it sustainable? Is it something that could alter? You're saying superhuman. Is it sustainable in a way that could help us long term in health and make us live longer in a way that could benefit us if we're safe about this or understand it better?
So it is fair to say yes, but there has to be some caveats to that, right? One of the simple caveats is that in bodybuilding, the pursuit of mass is a desirable outcome for many men. Just the sheer fact that I walk around at 260 pounds is not conducive to that outcome. We have two opposing vectors here. They're going in different directions. I weigh too much. Part of the reason that my body weight is because of the application of growth promotion agents and resistance training and the sheer intake of food. Just the food I take in is not sustainable over time. I eat too much food. So there is a conversation about the application of these drugs to create the supernatural man, but then some of our behaviors are not supportive of that. The food intake, the sheer weight that we carry around, if that makes sense. But the point I was making is when people talk about, is that sustainable? Yes, because we're talking about drugs that are already lifetime sustainable. This is a conversation, as I said before, about dose. So you have your next door neighbor on the right-hand side is taking testosterone. He will take that to the day he dies. You have your neighbor on the left-hand side taking recombinant human growth hormone because he's growth hormone deficient. He will take that for the rest of his life. You have a neighbor across the street who's a type 1 diabetic. He will take insulin for the rest of his life. These are lifetime sustainable drugs. The conversation then is about the dose. The point I was making, however, is so that is possible. But what drives our community ultimately is a big part of the problem, and people don't understand this. Many women in this sport have issues with food. They just do. If you don't know that, you're not a coach. If you don't know, lots and lots and lots of women that are attracted to, that are drawn to this lifestyle, bringing with them baggage. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm saying we should help the people, but you have to acknowledge that. That's just true. Yeah. Now,
men have baggage too. I mean,
I haven't got to that point
100%. Yet. Add ego into it, right? Come on.
many of the female baggage, a lot of the female baggage you see is food issues, though. Now, many of the men, I mean the overwhelming percentage of men who are attracted to anabolic steroids, they're here for the wrong reasons. Yeah. They have body dysmorphia issues. They have self-esteem issues. They have 1,001 problems. And these underlying issues drive the overuse of these things. Like it's the old story of, like, everyone wants to be financially successful, but every now and again you come across some exceptional individual that creates staggering wealth. And I don't think it's unreasonable to say, but when you start to dig, you realize something's driving that individual. Yeah. They're very often driven by something different, yeah? So they're trying to prove something to somebody, or, they usually very balanced, healthy individuals stay in the middle ground of society. And when we push out to the extremes of society and the extremes of our tribal behaviors, you very often come across people that are coming to the table not as balanced individuals, but they're coming with issues. Yeah? Men, I'm directing this to men. And so very often the abuse of steroids is something that is driven not by a balanced mind, but an imbalanced mind. I look in the mirror, I don't see myself as a 220-pound bodybuilder. I need more. I can't take a break because the guy that trains across in the gym, he looks like he's making progress. I know I've been doing it for 9 months. I know I should be taking a break. I know I should be allowing my organs to recover from the stress I apply them, but I'm going to keep applying these stresses because I'm comparing myself to another individual. I need to beat him. Does that make sense?
Steroids themselves, do they have some sort of additional effect on mental health? Are they psychoactive? Do they amplify personality? I mean, what sort of mental health effects do steroids have?
It's extremely controversial, but what I would argue is the three areas that we need to concern ourselves today with are our kidneys, our heart, and our brain. We used to focus on things like liver health and acne and gynecomastia. These things, I don't want to dismiss them, but they're so easy to fix that it's laughable. Do this and this, it's gone. And let's move on to the serious conversation, kidneys, heart, and the brain. And I would argue that the changes, so balancing out the hormonal profile has the potential to improve someone's mental balance. If you take someone who's very depressed and give them a physiological dose of testosterone, very often that outcome is a positive outcome. But there's what we call an inverted J curve attached here. So some provides beneficial outcome. But as you continue to raise the dose more and more and more, you go up through the other side of the curve, if that makes sense. Yeah. So there's a point where you would say, for example, when we talk about brain health, we would consider testosterone to be neuroprotective at moderate dosages. Walking around in a hypergonadal state is not good for your brain, right? It's not good for depression. There's 1,000 things one would talk about. A man walking around with heavily suppressed testosterone levels really should try to bring that back to middle ground, yeah? But if you keep going, there's deleterious consequence here. There's no question of that whatsoever. And this is part of my argument about modulating the 13 metabolic pathways moderately rather than pressing too hard on the androgen receptor, because that is the pathway through which we cause the greatest damage. This is the great irony when people historically have said, you don't need growth hormone, you're not a professional. You don't need insulin, you're not a professional. I'm saying, but you have to understand that by comparison to anabolic steroids, growth hormone is relatively benign. You can make an argument about the deleterious effects of growth hormone. I have no problem with that. But I would much rather see someone take a little bit of androgens and a little bit of growth hormone and a little bit of insulin, 1 + 1 + 1, for a equals +5 outcome than not using growth hormone and not using insulin and only using anabolic steroids to try and chase the same level of outcome.
It's interesting. It's like where is natural, right? Like we're in a time where we're seeing men are a little bit more feminine than they used to be. And there's a lot of crossover in a lot of different things. So at what baseline now, like the baseline is set by image? Is it Instagram? Is it, Chris Bumstead in Classic Physique? Is it, what the doctor's testosterone normal level parameters are when you go get your blood work done? And then that's different from male to female. And then this ties back into the image identity, I guess you could say, crisis that we're kind of living right now, where we're trying to siphon through all the information while position ourselves as a species amongst each other while identifying and coexisting. So at what point is healthy? You know what I mean? Like you go to the gym, your testosterone, you eat better, you stay natural, you go to the gym, you stay consistent for a couple of years. 9 out of 10 times, that's going to help everything move in a better direction for a natural state. But is there a better natural state? Is there a higher natural state? And I think that's what you're saying. It's not as black and white as I get drunk, that fucks me up, or you know what I mean? So, I take TRT, so I'm going to be angry as hell. Like it's so many different moving conversations all at the same time.
Agreed. And this is where I managed to offend everyone. So far I have offended X percentage of our community. Now I'm going to offend the medical practice, right? Okay, here's a classic one. So who determined that testosterone replacement therapy, the guideline should be 500 milligrams a week? Who made that up, right? Literally, why can we not go out and do a survey of the elite naturals of this world? And we have this information. I'm not saying it's speculative. We know what this is, right? And ascertain, well, these healthy young men, the most elite among us, walk around with testosterone levels approaching, 1,200 to 1,300 nanograms per deciliter, right? That's bear with me the math, that's 2.5 times, what TRT is. Why can that not be the benchmark? You know? And I would argue then this becomes an interesting conversation, because what I call TRT and what my doctor calls TRT is different. What I call TRT is this. I want to know what the elite natural of this world, their endocrine profile looks like, and I want that. I don't care about what average Joe has, and the Endocrine Society's benchmark for success as a TRT outcome is very low. That's a long way down the list here, okay? And you might improve quality of life by this margin, but who said you cannot have? If you experience testosterone production levels during puberty of, say, 1,300 nanograms per deciliter, what is the argument for artificially maintaining that through a larger portion of your life, where it normally drops away? Yeah. Why can we not maintain the highest peak that we realize as natural individuals? Why can we not retain our best sense of self through life? Now, this is the argument. When you have the argument, it's very difficult to say why not. Like, it's hard. It's fair enough to say, well, maybe testosterone levels decline because there's a reason they need to decline, but that's highly speculative. That's not evidence-based. We don't have any evidence that says testosterone falls away to protect us from these deleterious outcomes. So again, this is the challenge with these types of conversations. I offend everybody. I offend the medical community. I offend the endocrinologist society. I offend the bros. I offend everybody. I would argue this, and that it's really simple, that the argument to what you said is very simple. If you follow the Black model, what you would do is you would first look at what God gave you, or whatever your beliefs are. What is your endocrine profile today? What does it look like? Right. And how does that stack up against the best of us? Right. And then the argument is, why are you not entitled to, that was a strong word, but why are you not entitled to artificially modulate yourself to at least to those levels? And then what I would argue is, once you get to those levels, that's enough for 95% of us. So the application of approved for human use drugs, therapeutic drugs, designed to elicit outcomes along these metabolic pathways to the absolute limits of what is plausible naturally, right, would be a model that, in my opinion, that is our future, whether people understand or not. Now, whether we self-administer, we're in such early days in this regard, whether we self-administer that outcome or whether that becomes a societal norm, I'm going to argue that's where we're heading. We're going to figure out
both male and female should. If it's something,
absolutely,
if it's something that's going to make us live longer, stay stronger, and grow healthier as a species as a whole. I mean, yeah. I try to keep up with my wife at the gym. She's been doing it for 20 years. I'm only 3 years solid in, like at the end of the day, she's rowing 20 pounds less than me. There's no ego there. I'm learning. I mean, she's a savage, at the end of the day, she's got time under her belt. She's strong, and she could do things that most women that I've met can't even do. And she's been natural. So to think that ultimately she's extending her life to a greater degree, her heart health, her internal health, her mental health. She's stronger with a lean mass that she's holding, her mental health and capacity. She sleeps better. Everything's just better all the way around. I mean, to me, that's inspiring. It makes me work harder. Doesn't matter male or female. Well,
it makes me sound pretty good. I'll keep them around.
Yeah, I'm working here. No, so but really, it's great. It's very interesting to hear at what point now are we changing this gene expression and moving it in a direction where we can ultimately modulate it towards an even greater species, which is what the conversation is you're having right now, which is
and this is why I use terms like it's meant to be gender neutral, supernatural man. That's something different to the abuse of PEDs. Yeah, we're creating this artificially constructed endocrine model that nobody was ever born with, but it's plausible that someone could have it. Let's create that. And I would argue, place yourself there. How is that any different to cosmetic surgery, realistically? How is that any different to the modulation of estrogen and progesterone for, what can only really be described as choice outcomes with birth control? That's a choice. That's a choice women are entitled to, but it's a choice nonetheless. Yeah. So the challenge is there's these conversations, but we as a bodybuilding community are so far disconnected from these conversations. Like, this is what should be happening. This is a conversation, come over here. And these are the conversations that I try to have with my community within Masterclass. But That's not the conversations that are happening within our tribe. Within our tribe, we have things to say. If I cover things, oh my God, we can't talk about the transgender community. Oh my God, we can't talk about PCOS. I don't suffer from PCOS. How is that relevant to me? Women during pregnancy, what happens to their hormonal profile? It should be a very interesting subject. Like what do we actually see? Even things like I'm a big advocate of men running their estrogen levels as high as they can tolerate them. Estrogen is a hypertrophic pathway in its own right. It's cardiac protective, it's cognitive protective, it's renal protective. It's very, very difficult to describe what the deleterious consequence of running high estrogen are. No one can give me like a side effect. There is no side effect that people can describe. Very often people will say it's things like water retention, but estrogen doesn't cause water retention. That's the job of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So in other words, if I'm advocating that, what I'm saying is, well, where's the limit? There must be a limit somewhere. It's not just the sky's the limit. And I would argue, well, let's use the limits set by the Endocrine Society for men going the other way. For men that want to identify as women, they give them this much estrogen, right? There's no deleterious consequence to their prostate. There's no deleterious consequence to their heart. So if endocrinologists are prepared to give men this much estrogen that want to identify as women and have no concern about the consequence of that behavior, and I look at estrogen as being, hypertrophic pathway, good for your heart, good for your brain, good for your thing. Why would I not set my estrogen levels higher than male physiology and leverage those benefits? I'm going to set them as high as the Endocrine Society would give me if I wanted to identify women. You have to understand how controversial that is. That is like, oh my God, nobody has ever spoken in those terms before. And you're upsetting everybody, the medical community, the people that say your estrogen needs to be contained, the people that think that estrogen is a female hormone. This is an outrageous statement. The people that blame estrogen for everything under the sun. You have to understand, for 60 years, estrogen was the enemy. Yeah, estrogen was blamed for all sorts of things that estrogen didn't actually do. The same as with women. Women historically haven't even identified testosterone as a female hormone. Of course, it's a female hormone. There are even people that would argue women don't need testosterone; they need estrogen and progesterone. Like, I just don't agree. There's no quality evidence to support that argument. So the drain we're circling around here, guys, is it doesn't matter who you talk to, whether you're talking to an endocrinologist, when you're talking to a general practitioner, whether you're talking to someone in the gym whether you're talking to a coach. I am frustrated by the quality of conversations and the quality of debate that goes along. And I'm all open debate. I want people to step up and have the argument, why can't we do this? Why can't we set testosterone levels at 1,300 nanograms per deciliter? Why not? Please, the world's experts in androgen research step up and tell us why that's not practical. Today, we're simply told, don't do it. 500 is the rule. You're going to have to explain to me why I can't go back to the levels I enjoyed, as a young, healthy man. Why can't I have the levels that we see in elite natural athletes? What is the reason?
Speaking of, let's bring up the TRT subject real quick and talk about natural bodybuilding. I know you talked about how, I think within 2 weeks of basically you're in a weight loss process, wasn't it a natural bodybuilder, the level of testosterone tanked like 63%? Was it 2 weeks?
I wouldn't say 2 weeks, but anyone that has any experience in natural bodybuilding knows that as you approach stage body composition, your entire endocrine profile becomes a shit show. Like it's literally horrible. So testosterone tanks, your growth hormone tanks, cortisol spikes, thyroid hormone tanks. Pretty much every hormone that is what we're talking about modulated here tanks. And as I said, we're leaning back to that. So those are the rules of natural bodybuilding. Now, the reason that they ban testosterone replacement therapy from natural bodybuilding is you have to appreciate having that up your sleeve is an unfair advantage to someone. Yeah. So you have two athletes on the stage. One has normal testosterone levels because he's artificially modulating them. I should say normal testosterone, normal DHT, and normal estrogen because they all matter. Yeah. And then the next guy next to him, his hormonal profile is in the toilet. Now, what I would argue is one that is without question an unfair advantage by artificially modulating them. But it's, plausibly safer. It's plausibly better for you because it causes less stress. Yeah. It's very hard to argue that, whether you're a male or whether you're a female, tanking your body composition to climb on stage is a healthy pursuit. And then lifting up, even simple things like if you understand that one of the ways that the body modulates its metabolic rate, is through the modulation of the thyroid hormones T4 and T3. These decline under those conditions. So just the very virtue of, putting these drugs back into the system at normal levels, not exceeding actual production levels, just normal, offsets that metabolic adaptation to some degree. You could argue for that as being a healthier way to diet for competitions.
But I think that's a great explanation, and that's for the audience to understand why is TRT banned in natural bodybuilding. Yeah. That's such a great explanation, and I'm hoping that you can also touch on briefly going back to female virilization and female drug protocols. And there's a compound called anavar. And if you're listening and you've been a bodybuilder for a while, you probably have heard it at least once, or maybe your coach has recommended it to you. But it seems to be like the go-to compound for female bodybuilding who are going into the enhanced route. It's like the first thing that people go to. Can you explain why? And can you also explain why you recommend it, that it should be the last thing that's recommended to women?
So this is going to be a 5 minute. This could be 5 minutes here. A little attitude here. Yeah. Sorry. So the first thing we need to understand is this: the real threat to women is not the application of androgens in an acute time frame. It's the duration of exposure. Yeah. So when you look at the historical clinical application of anabolic steroids to women for therapeutic benefits, some of the doses that you see in the literature are eye-watering. They're like, how much? They gave them how much? Like, wow, right? But you have to understand, but the premise here is, so here's a woman who is experiencing a disease state that needs this treatment methodology, and we expose her to this treatment methodology. And then when that treatment is passed, she never sees that drug again in her life. It's an acute one-time application. It's a one-time deal. Yep. So the application of those drugs is vastly different from someone that's taking them recreationally and taking them. The greatest risk to women in enhancement practice today is not the amount of androgens she's taking or the choice of female-friendly androgens she's taking. It's the duration of exposure over her career. Okay? So the best way I can describe that is, we talked about the transgender community before. We know that if you give a woman 50 milligrams of testosterone, she doesn't transform into the male identity in 2 weeks. It takes time. Gradually, this happens, yeah? It's very similar to the process that young men go through when they experience puberty. They don't wake up one day and they look like this. It's androgens elevate, and gradually over time, we start to see these physiological changes occur, yeah? And with women, the big change that we need to worry about, there's three real core questions we need to ask here. If we set aside the understanding that it's really not about organ health, yes, you can absolutely, without question, cause drug-induced organ injury, no question. But at the doses that are actually required for female physique competition, it's not a discussion about organ health. It's really a discussion about virilization. Then you really need to understand there's three core areas. One is unwanted hair growth. One is changes to sexual anatomy, and two is changes to the vocal architecture. These are the three things that most women identify with. Is there anything else you wanted to add to that list to make sure we cover those?
I think that's great. That's a great start, because I'd like to talk about specific divisions in bodybuilding, like wellness, that you're seeing extreme protocols. I'd like to talk about that.
Well, you can add size as well. I mean, when you look at female bodybuilding today versus 10 or 20 years ago, it's doubled in size, right? So
yeah. I meant so much in terms of deleterious effect that a lot of people would consider it to be a desired outcome. They're chasing that. What they want to avoid is unwanted hair growth,
and facial structure change.
Yeah,
facial structure.
Yeah, understood. So what I would say is, when we put those in order of consequence, and this is a little embarrassing, I apologize, but most women who experience some change in sexual architecture, it's not unwelcomed. They see an increase in the size of sexual anatomy, but it's not like it becomes a microphallus. It's a 25% increase in the size of your clitoris. Very, very rarely do women complain about this. I talk to women all the time. They're just going like, my husband and I are very happy. Thank you very much. Let's move on to the next thing. It's a non-issue. Interesting. It's taboo to talk about it, but most women are not worried about it. Yeah. You see the outliers, and typically it's men to point to this. Men see these like extreme examples, like at the far end of the spectrum. I'm not saying they don't exist, but it's not a typical response. Yeah. And they get concerned about that. And I understand that, but we validate that by saying, look, we really need to address the body of the audience. And then that one outlier over there we deal as a separate conversation. It can happen. That's an extreme outcome, but that is abuse, outright abuse. And so then we end up with the discussion about unwanted hair growth. To be honest with you, most women are okay with that, especially as they get a little bit older, because they're going, look, I'm surrounded by dozens of friends that are going through the same thing at this point in their life where they're seeing more unwanted hair growth and they don't use androgens. And the point I'm making is not to try to dismiss this conversation about unwanted hair growth, but by the time you wax your arms and your legs and it's not the same conversation that people think it is. The real conversation here is changes to the vocal architecture. This is the 800-pound gorilla in the room. And the main reason behind that.
In the face.
That's fair. So the changes to the vocal architecture are very interesting because it's the very first change we see. Yeah. So when you look at the process, you start to notice a change in viralization and the problem in vocal architecture. And the problem is once you see that change, it never goes back. It's a permanent thing. Once you take a non-viralized voice box and you viralize it and you change the architecture, it cannot go back. Yeah. And we know this because all the evidence we have from the transgender community, the people that were basically born as male identity and wish to be identified as female. It doesn't matter what they do beyond, vocal coaching. There's surgery, but there's not really a solution that makes the male voice box sound female. But the interesting thing here is prepubescent men and women have effectively the same vocal architecture. It's the application of androgens that cause those changes. Okay. But the androgens that cause those changes don't happen in a week. They don't happen in 2 weeks. It's a duration of relatively low elevation of androgens, okay, natural male range kind of thing over a block of time. And so the point I'm leading to here is this. If you're a woman, what I'm suggesting is if you're going to be in this game for 1 year, it really doesn't matter what you do. Okay. The problem is, but if you're going to hang around for 10 years or 15 years or 20 years, you better have a plan for the application of androgens. And the application of androgens cannot be the first line of action. You cannot put anavar or any other anabolic steroid on the table as the first line of action. Why? Because you have 20 years ahead of you. The logical, rational model says, right, it's not that we're not going to use anavar. It's not that we're not going to use another anabolic steroid, but we need to do everything we can to make as much progress towards our goals as we can by using drugs that are demonstrated not to cause these outcomes in women. Now, that doesn't mean they might not have problems of their own. I'll give you a simple example. No one could argue that growth hormone doesn't have a list of problems that we can discuss. Yeah, but virilization is not one of them. Okay, so you could give a woman a unit of growth hormone pretty much every day for the rest of her life, and we're not too concerned about, like, you're going to have to describe the problem to me, if that makes sense. Yeah, so you could use a drug like clenbuterol or thyroid hormone or another fat burning agent, and we could talk about the problems associated with it, but virilization is not attached to that discussion. Virilization only attaches to the conversation about the application of androgens. And so if you think about it logically, if we have a piece of paper and we write down a list of all the drugs that we might plausibly use, and androgens are the ones that scare us the most as a woman because we're worried about what they might do to our vocal architecture, we would never put that on the table as first line of action. It just makes no sense whatsoever. We would do everything we possibly could before we introduce that class of compound. Now, you don't need to know anything about the clinical literature to go, no, but that just makes a lot of sense. But ironically, because anabolic steroids are so easy to access, they're so inexpensive, and they're so easy to administer in the form of like anavar, ease makes it the first action. take 10 milligrams once a day, take it for this many weeks, stop using it. You know what I mean? So in other words, we're making decisions about what we should be doing for a 20-year career, not based on what is the right, rational, logical model to follow, but how easy it is to execute.
How much dosage comparative to the 50 milligrams of testosterone you said is a week is what is given to a female who wants to become a man, transgender? What is the equivalent of anavar in dose?
It's very hard to give you a hard number, but I'll give you a rough one. So if you understand that 50 milligrams a week is the beginning journey for transgender therapy for women, 50 milligrams of testosterone, yeah? Many women start the journey in this scope at 10 milligrams of anavar a day. It's a very common starting point, yeah? But that tends to escalate over time, and then they end up on 15 milligrams or 20 milligrams. So you understand there's 140 milligrams of anavar a week versus 50 milligrams of testosterone a week. Now, anyone that's in this space would know that anavar is not as androgenic as testosterone. That is fair, right? So there's an allowance here that says, okay, so we get to use more anavar before we have an equivalent milligram consequence of testosterone. Does that make sense? Yeah. But what I would argue is hang on a sec, 150, 40 milligrams, like we're not talking about 100 to 1 anabolic ratio here. If we were to argue that by modifying the testosterone molecule, the scientists were able to take 90% of the virilization outcome away from, anavar or something like that drug, I think that's probably about right. Like it's a 10 to 1 thing. Yeah. So in other words, 50 milligrams of testosterone is 5 milligrams of anavar. Yeah. Okay. But then what happens is people start to use more and more and more and more of the drugs, and they use them for longer and longer and longer. And this is what I said. If I'm very serious when I say, if a woman was going to compete for 1 year and she was going to expose herself even to 20 milligrams of anavar for 12 weeks leading up to a competition and then retire and walk away, no, I'm not in any way really concerned about this. We have plenty of clinical literature that would support that dosing protocol for that kind of duration with minimum consequence of effect, but not 20 years of that behavior, not and over and over and over and over and over again. So again, we need to shift the conversation away from not just how much you're taking or the drug that you'll take for us, but what is going to be your plan for the next 20 years? Yeah. So the difference here between women is we need to move the conversation into the vector of time, duration of exposure. There's very good evidence, and we're talking about the drug Winstrol now, okay, that you can create virilization in women on as little as 4 milligrams of Winstrol a day if you give it to her long enough. Okay. So today we live in a world that people talk about two things. This class of drug is okay for women, that class of drug is not. I would completely disagree with that. For example, I think that testosterone replacement therapy for women is a very valid, therapeutic practice. The idea that women don't take testosterone, I disagree with. Yeah, I do agree it's the dose is the poison conversation, how much we're talking about here. But the idea that there's classes of drugs that women do use and don't use, I don't agree with. And then what we need to do is understand that it's not just about what drug we're using and how much we're using it, but what is going to be the strategy for the next X number of years moving forward. And the answer is I have a model that suits this argument very well. It simply works like this. You take a piece of paper, you write down every drug that you're able to access and you're comfortable using. Now, that's going to be different for everybody in the world. Some people will be happy using drugs like insulin. Some of the mere virtue of mentioning it is enough to put them off. And that's completely fair. I'm empathetic to that. But we start off with this list of drugs. On that list of drugs will be the line item anabolic steroids for women. Okay. And all I'm saying is we move that line item discussion to the very last thing we do. So we do as much as we can with everything we can, with all of the different classes of compounds that we can that don't induce virilization, and we leave anabolic steroids to the last. So the application of anabolic steroids for, say, 6 weeks a year, twice a year, is 12 weeks of exposure. My question to you is, well, what are you going to do for the rest of the year? If that makes sense. And what happens is women start off very often with that mindset, 6 weeks is fine, and then they do two blocks of it, and that's 12 weeks. But then how do you walk away from not having a growth promotion agent on the table? And so the 6 weeks becomes 12 weeks, the 12 weeks becomes 18 weeks, the 18 weeks becomes 24 weeks. And very often you find women that they're having 24 to 30 weeks of exposure to androgens a year, really because they just don't understand that there are different classes of compounds, and some of these compounds cause virilization outcomes and some do not. So if we start with all of the drugs, not saying they're not problematic, but all of the drugs that cannot cause virilization, and we deal with the problems, and then we keep the class of anabolic steroids to last, and we put it in and we take it out and put it in strategically, you can have a lifetime of exposure without the specter of virilization leaning over your shoulder. It's very, very, very simple.
But it's interesting because there's the new class, the wellness class, which is gaining a tremendous amount of attention, and people are just absolutely fascinated with this class. And it is an amazing class. So the wellness division is more of an asymmetrical shape where the legs, the glutes, the quads, everything is extremely jacked, calves, everything lower body, but the upper body is more in line with a bikini competitor, maybe not. So it's not proportioned, it's not symmetrical, but this class itself is just because the visual legs and the glutes are just so amazing. They're shocking to people. It's new. This division is really gaining a significant amount of momentum. And you did a post recently that showed protocols that you're seeing women who are in this wellness division being given, and you're just absolutely mind blown. Can you talk a little bit about that and why you're seeing this and what you're seeing and how damaging long-term or even short-term the doses that are given to these women? You can share a little bit about that.
I'm going to expose my own weaknesses as a human being. We all suffer bias. We all suffer filters. Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah. My own is this. I'm quite serious when I say, in my opinion, the knowledge of application of PED drugs varies around the world. Yeah. I live in Thailand, in Asia. The knowledge here is horrible. It's horrible. Yeah. And I would argue one of the reasons that you're commenting on that is, whether it's true or not, it is my bias that the South Americans are driving that force, and I don't think their knowledge is very good. So you're seeing these outcomes without understanding what they're really doing now. Is that fair? I don't know. I'm open to, if someone wants to stand up and defend the knowledge of the coaches in South America about what they're doing, that's fine. That is just my opinion. That's all it is. I don't have any evidence to support that, but it is my opinion. When you go to India, when you go to Southeast Asia, when you go to South America, when you go to Africa, they don't know what they're doing. They have no idea what they're doing. You know? So whether that's true, whether that's not, I'll wear it. People can make their own judgment calls, but I would argue that class is being driven out of South America.
But the levels that you're seeing, can you give an example? We were talking about anavar versus testosterone versus transgender community and some of the compounds that at Women Wellness Division, the amounts that you're seeing.
Yeah, maybe that, because I did get a couple of comments on that post. I think people might have misunderstood what I'm saying there. I think it's fair to say, and this applies to men and women equally, yeah, that from the beginning of time, since we started using this thing, there has been a range of approaches to the application of drugs that has ranged from mild to, wow, you're going to die. Yeah, that's probably fair. Yeah. I made a post that was a case study that was reported out of South America for a bikini competitor and a wellness competitor that quoted doses. But you have to understand that was what we call N=1, an individual competitor. Okay. So that doesn't mean when you look at the stage and that particular girl that was in that biochemical profile was, standing in the center of the stage, that the woman to her left was doing exactly what she was doing, nor the woman to her right. It was simply pointing to the fact that these practices do exist within those classes. And I would argue, just as for men, there's a spectrum of abuse that ranges from moderate use for someone like myself to like, wow. The interesting thing, though, and this is, I think this is very easy to demonstrate, but you can only demonstrate it through observation, is professional athletes do not abuse drugs as much as amateurs do. Professional athletes tend to have two things on their side. One is genetics, right? And two is sometimes a better head for the future. Yeah. A lot of the guys and girls that are abusing the drugs the most don't have the genetics and they haven't broken through yet. So they're not surrounded by other people's behaviors so much. And, there are coaches out there that, I'm the guy that can get you your pro card. A lot of the time, what that means when you think about that, if you're a good coach and you know what you're doing and someone's saying, I can get you your pro card, I mean, let's be honest with you, what that means is more drugs. Because the fundamental difference between a high quality nutrition program from one coach to the next, the amount of variables that you can modulate, right? I'm not saying they don't do anything, but they're not wow. It's like you're adjusting the dials gently in and skilled set of hands controlling training programming and nutritional programming. I'm not saying it doesn't add value, but how do you claim to get someone a pro card? Like, it's a very interesting claim, right? To me, that simply means if I took all of my clients and doubled their dosages, we would win more trophies. That's just my opinion. Again, now that can upset people. I don't really care, because you have to say, what does that mean when someone says I'm the guy that gets people pro cards? What do you mean by that? You have genetics that doesn't change as they move coaches. Training principles and nutritional principles and supplementation principles are, for all intents purposes, within a ballpark to each other. The one great variable that is on the table that people are talking about has to be the drugs. And again, I see protocols from a great many people that on one level they'll go onto a podcast and they'll talk about the need to be moderate, and then I'll see the protocols that they're giving their clients and they cannot be described as moderate. So there is an interesting story, an interesting thread for people to pull on there. But I would argue this: the spectrum of behaviors that we see massively varies. And very typically, the worst abuse that we see are people at the upper levels of amateur breakthrough. They're desperately wanting to break through and get their pro card. Typically, that's the group of people that I see the greatest abuse in. They have the least amount of knowledge about what they're doing, and they're using typically the greatest dosages. And the post you're referring to is there was a bikini wellness competitor taking 450 milligrams a week of androgens. Now, just as a side note to that, let me explain this. You have to understand, in the 1970s, they gave 1,200 milligrams a week of primobolan to women, right? Nothing to do with bodybuilding, therapeutical practice. When women had estrogen-mediated breast cancer, the treatment methodology was 300 milligrams a week of masteron. So this becomes the interesting, the washing machine that we get into, saying, well, so here's a wellness competitor taking 450 milligrams of androgens, conversation one. Here's historical clinical practice where they gave women for estrogen-mediated breast cancer purposes 1,200 milligrams of primobolan. Yeah, it's an interesting washover effect. Now, what I would argue is this is the point about time. If that bikini competitor wanted to take 450 milligrams of androgens for 8 weeks and retire, you could probably defend her behaviors based on what we have in clinical evidence, but not again and again and again and again, because the difference is in the clinical studies, they apply it and remove the stimulus and it's gone.
It's interesting that the way you cross over wellness, again, identity, right? You're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying that from South American and African to Asia and whatnot, it's an image that they're trying to achieve. And these trainers or coaches they're pushing a certain agenda potentially, is what you're saying, right? To achieve this particular look, right? Is that what you're going for?
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is, and I want to be very careful. I don't want to connect the competitors on the stage to what we see in society. I'm trying to keep it, but it's fair to say there's been an explosion of cosmetic procedures in that part of the world where basically they stick fillers in your butt to make your butt stick out.
100%.
I don't agree with the behavior. I think it's an extremist behavior, but it's a cultural desire in that part of the world to have that physical appearance. Now, whether they achieve it through training and modulation of growth promoting drugs, or whether cosmetic surgery, or let's be honest, both, at the same time, it's an extremist behavior, and I don't necessarily think it's sustainable.
Some of it I would say would potentially be genetic, right? I mean, you see,
correct, agreed.
Not to be offensive to anybody, but you do see naturally Black women with bigger asses and Hispanic
agreed.
Women with bigger asses. Like, again, not to be offensive to anybody listening, but that's just kind of the way it is genetically. You see that, and that agreed. The wellness division is kind of leaned into a little bit more, trying redefine or define that particular image as a species. It's interesting to think about, as I'm listening to you put it all together, how short-term versus long-term use. We've talked about safety protocols, in long-term life goals. We've talked about whether or not you're using it for sports specific, enhancement, or bodybuilding as a sport specific, and mindset and addiction all the way around. At what point could we use any of these pathways and use them to create the effect needed to achieve positive results, minimizing the negative outcomes of whatever we're implying, whatever substance we're using? At what point can we stop using them and keep these results, like that bone density, that lean mass? Or is there a point of no return? Are we going to age ourselves faster and it's not good? Or are those last 10 or 20 years now better, as you would say? I feel like young again, and it was worth it, because what are really the golden years all about if I'm in a wheelchair? So where's that line? Is it kind of grade still? What do you see that as?
It's interesting you raise that, because I would argue that legitimate need elevates with age. Yeah, it's fair to say that many of these hormonal pathways that I'm advocating that we modulate decline with age. This is, very, very clearly held in evidence. So you could very easily argue that many of my, and it's true, many of my models are premised on what is happening in sarcopenia, which is the age-related muscle wasting. Yeah. So we have an aging population. You understand, I'm in my mid-50s. I'm interested in this conversation. I'm interested in age-related cognitive decline. I'm interested in physical decline. Many of the principles have direct parallels to what's happening in sarcopenia. They're not saying, okay, so as we get older, we're going to introduce testosterone, the conversation's over. That's not the research paradigm. The research paradigm is a multifaceted approach to a multifaceted problem. We have an issue with insulin sensitivity. What are we going to do about that? We have an issue with lipid skewing, cholesterol profiles. What are we going to do about that? And so the parallels between what I'm proposing as Supernatural Man, like a lot of the inspiration, a lot of the motivation for what that looks like is actually drawn from what I believe the future of aging looks like. The conversation becomes one of, you have to be very careful between where you draw these compounds down from. I am very passionate we should only be using approved for human use drugs, not abandoned research chemicals. It's fair to say in the next 20 years, we're going to see new drugs come onto the market that fill needs that, either they'll do the job better than what we have today, or they will do things that we cannot do today. That's fair. But ultimately, what it comes down to is managing the risk and the reward. I think describing the reward is relatively simple. It's pretty straightforward. As you get older and you see age-related cognitive and age-related hormonal decline, can we offset that through behaviors like nutrition and training and pharmacology? I think the answer is really easy. It's yes, that's the goal here. Yeah. The devil is in the detail. And what I would argue with all of these conversations is, I go back to what I was saying before about testosterone, but there's an inverted J curve here. In other words, adding a little bit more of thyroid hormone is potentially beneficial, but if you keep adding it and adding it and adding it, eventually you would expect to see a deleterious consequence. In the case of thyroid hormone T3, that might be a catabolic effect on tissue. So more makes us more hypertrophic, more anabolic. But if you keep going, you cross the threshold and become catabolic. And I think that framework applies to everything. This is a conversation not about the identification and modulation of these pathways. I think that's really easy to defend. Yeah, whether it's an age-related discussion, whether it's trying to make quote unquote natural bodybuilding more healthy, more sustainable, whether it's trying to pull the guys over here at the extreme end down more into the middle of the curve. It's really easy to defend that. The conversation really is over. And this is why I say sometimes when I think, if you're still arguing that you should be taking anabolic steroids and starting at so many milligrams a week, and then you increase the dose until you reach a toxic level and then move on to the next class of drugs, you've been left behind. We've moved forward from that. Now the conversation is, right, so these are the metabolic pathways. These are the drugs that we have. Which ones are we going to choose, and how much are we going to use, and what methodologies we're going to place to ensure that we're doing this in a sustainable manner?
It's so interesting too, when you're talking about, substances and whatnot, and we're in the same debate. We're having debates about food. I mean, there's so many different models right now. I mean, you can attest to this too. I mean, I've done just about everything.
Well, I think there's one challenge that I think that I'd like to bring up here, and is to talk about the legality of all of this, because
can I just answer the food question? Well, sorry, can I just answer that food question first, and then we'll do that? Yeah, sorry.
Well, the legality is more like making sure you get the right compounds. So
no, I understand that, but about the you said that the argument about the food, about the keto, the carnivore, the thing.
Grains, no grains, fats, no fats, good fats, bad fats, cholesterol, all that. I mean, it's just a whole nother conversation.
It's absolutely the same conversation, though. So here's the thing: if you think about it, right? So here's the thing that drives most people towards a diet model, right, is how easy it is. It's not whether it's the right one. It's not whether it's the wrong one. It's not whether you're going to get the best outcome. It's how easy it is. I'll give you a simple example. People that don't like eating vegetables and don't like eating fruit are drawn to carnivore. It's got nothing to do, for the most part, for who's attracted to carnivore, whether carnivore has merits or not. Those people are attracted to that model. Now, if you understand it, people that write diet models understand that you were not going to sell 100,000 copies of a book called The Balanced Diet in 2022, right? You have
Mike
to
T.
offer
Nelson,
something.
He's trying. Flex Diet certified. Get certified. You rock, Mike.
There you go. So you understand the premise here, and that is many of these successful models are actually designed from the outset to appeal to a particular niche. And easy. That appeals to me because it aligns to my pre-existing biases or beliefs or whatever like that. Yeah. A lot of the people that are interested in what I have to do tend to be older guys. They're in their 40s and their 50s, and looking at that through the lens of what someone who's 20 years old is not listening about the food model premise, and that is what actually drives much of the miscommunication and misunderstanding here is the motivations of the audiences that are attracted to the various models. Unashamedly, most people that are interested in my materials are already massively aware of the poor quality of educational content available. I don't need to convince them of that. They know that. They're going, oh my God, thank God, finally someone is coming along and presenting an evidence-based argument, and they're all over what I'm saying. The great masses, though, aren't even yet aware that there's a problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah. For everyone listening, he was breaking it up a little bit, but I believe we got it all. Essentially, what he's saying is that diets are fads and food is fuel, and you have to understand the human species as a whole biologically, which takes a lifetime, and we still have no idea. We're still learning all the time. And you know what I mean? Like, we're in this conversation on the bleeding edge right now, and he's a part of that. He's a part of that conversation in many different facets. So
agree. So we're talking about the legalities. I cut you off. I thought that was important to say that. So you're saying you're concerned about the legal implications of this. So maybe I can just make
twofold. Yeah, it's twofold. So the question really is, number one, we have this knowledge that you've just shared with us about certain compounds or just shouldn't be given to women in the first place, but they often are. And then of the ones that are anabolics, there are levels of androgen response, and the ones that have more favorable are something like an anavar, and ones that aren't, you can probably share what those compounds are, but you don't know what you're getting in the mail. Unless you're
completely agree.
Testing it, you don't know. So there is that from the legality. It's like, well, how are people? It's just like some states, it's a felony to even have the products in your hand. And now we're ordering this stuff, and you can't even be sure because it's black market that it's what you're getting. So it's kind of like a twofold question. How is it so rampantly used and how easily accessible? And then at the same time, how can you be so sure that what you're getting is what you think you're getting, and you're hoping to not be viralized? And then next thing you know.
Yeah. So this would be, again, every thread we pull on breaks into multiple pathways. Let me quickly cover. This is one of the reasons that I'm such an advocate of the use of testosterone in women. Okay. testosterone is really the only anabolic steroid in common use in our community that you could administer to a woman and then send her to a pathology laboratory and on demand call up a hormonal profile that basically says, so we administered this much of the drug and we saw this much serum response. It's the only one. Yep. And that is very interesting for us because then we can basically, start with a strategy, administer the strategy, and then titrate for effect. Yeah. That makes that drug very interesting. The second thing is you really don't have a quality problem with testosterone in the world today. Yeah, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but most of the problems around drug quality revolve around the more expensive anabolic steroids like anavar and primabol. And the reason behind that is if you're going to go that trouble of counterfeiting a product and selling a product, you're not going to do it for something that's very cheap and easy to access. You're going to move up the food chain and find the more valuable things to counterfeit. Yeah, so I would argue that you should view this sort of filter saying about 50% of the drugs that are marketed globally are as described. The quality problem is profound. It's a huge problem, yeah? But it does vary based on a couple of things, where you live in the world and how much you know. For example, the people that I deal with, these are legitimate individuals who have the best interests of the of the community at heart, and they're doing their best to contribute value to the world. In our world, I should say by that. So I don't really have quality assurance problems of that magnitude with my supply chain. But that's me after doing this for 20 years. Yeah. What I would argue is someone just starting out that doesn't have tremendous knowledge on these things is the most vulnerable for the people that just sell stuff. Yeah. Because it's fair to say that finding a source of these things is incredibly easy. Yeah. Ensuring that what you got when you paid for it is as described on the label is the challenge. So absolutely there's a question, but it's not a blanket problem. It changes on who we're talking about. You're talking about my supply chain or you're talking about Billy Bob's supply chain. That's a different conversation. And then also where you live in the world, understanding that there are, I think if I'm correct, there's 197 countries in the world. A lot of people tend to think in terms of where they live in the world. That's how their framework was. I live in Southeast Asia. This is a place that I chose to live because they're incredible. I mean, literally, I walk into the pharmacy and I point to the insulin and they hand it over the counter to me. I don't have to worry about half of the things that I source. Agreed, I cannot source everything in my models across the pharmacy counter. Agreed. But a significant percentage of things, I want to use the drug telmisartan, for example, as a prophylactic treatment against many of the ills that plague our tribe. My local pharmacy sells it to me across the counter, no questions asked. So when you talk about legalities and when you talk about supply chain, it is a moving conversation that varies based on where you live in the world and how much exposure and experience you have. And it ranges from incredibly difficult. I'm very empathetic to certain people. Like if you live in Australia and you don't know very much, or you live in New Zealand, you don't know very much, this is a huge problem. Versus for me, it's like, what are you talking about? Like it's not legal. I can use these drugs because I can buy them in the pharmacy.
Why
They're
do you
not.
do that there versus like we had the war on drugs here. So these drugs that we're talking about are classified in the same category as heroin, right? Here in the United States where we are.
Every country has its own laws regarding supply chain. Yeah, it is illegal to sell these drugs without a pharmaceutical license in Thailand. Yeah. So I can't, excuse me, let me say this. I can't set up shop to sell them. But I'm saying as a consumer, I can walk into a pharmacy and buy some testosterone over the counter, and the guy has a pharmaceutical license to sell it to me. The legal requirements for him to provide it to me are different than they are in the US compared to Southeast Asia. Yeah. So when people think in terms of legal, you have to understand, but there's 197 countries in the world. There's only 3 or 4 of them that it's illegal. Really? You guys have very, very tight controls on this. And part of the reason behind that is it's a very litigious society. Right? I go to my doctor. He's fascinated by everything I do. He wants to know everything. He's like, he's like a sponge. I remember I cut myself a while ago. I'd like to do enduro motorcycles. I'm quite the outdoors kind of guy here. And I cut myself and he was going to stitch it. And I said, can you glue it? And he says, well, I've never done it before, but I happen to have a go at it. And he just glued it In the US, you would get berated because you don't tell doctors what to do. They will determine the treatment pathway. And he looked at it and went, yeah, why not? Let's do that. Why? Because I can't sue him. There is no right of, like if you go into a hospital here and you get your treatment, you're entitled to a certain standard of care, but there is not the same legal, issues that you need to go through. And it's the same in a pharmacy. If I go and buy testosterone across the pharmacy counter and I self-administer it and self-abuse it and get myself into trouble, I can't go back, with my legal team to sue the pharmacist. You can in the US. So this is the great interesting is sometimes people don't realize, but you guys brought that on yourselves. Like people go, oh, it's the government. You're going, well, yeah, kind of, sort of, but you have to understand you have such a litigious society that if you go around suing everyone all the time, all of the channels get tightened down. One of the things about Thailand is I can't sue my pharmacist for what I do with the drugs that he hands across the counter for him. So it's much easier for me to get access to things that I want.
Were you being literal when you said there's 3 countries these drugs are illegal?
No. No, what I meant was there's 197 countries in the world. Yeah, I think that's right. What I would argue is places like the UK are in the middle ground. What I mean by that is possession for personal use is not illegal. Yeah, it's a middle ground thing. It's kind of like, where the marijuana debate is now a little bit. Like you can have 3 spliffs, but you can't have like 16 bushes growing in the backyard. Yeah. So the UK is different than Australia. Australia is like, it's kind of like, I would argue that Australia, New Zealand, and some of the Nordic countries have the toughest legislation there is. Yeah. America's the middle ground. There's loopholes. You can go to a hormone, therapy type facility that is kind of sort of masquerading as a quasi supply. Like it's a really fine line. It's like you're going, okay, so if you think about it, there's just a sliding scale of the ability to access these compounds at fair prices that varies from country to country. And what I would argue is that many of the people in our community, Australians, I'm Australian, that's one of the top 3 countries in the world that are hard. Yeah. Where a classic one is if you go to Dubai, people have this idea of when I go to Kuwait or when I go to Dubai that everything is, easy to get. And, you just walk into a pharmacy and get it. That's actually a fallacy. But it's a much easier supply chain than the US.
Interesting.
Yeah. So complicated subject, but I think it's enough to say when you take the global stage and you look at it, it varies so widely that it's very hard to say anything. Nothing that I am doing today, because I do not sell drugs, I use drugs and I talk to people about self-administration in the country that I reside in. Nothing I do is illegal.
I think this is why, if I am to interpret what you're doing is having the conversation. You open up the conversation so that we can understand and question why we're supposed to be a free country here in the United States, liberty, freedom, choice, and no one questions.
And I think that not only that, but when you bring up subjects that are uncomfortable for people, the first initial response is rejection. And that's just kind of how it is. Anything new is just like, it's so uncomfortable for people to even, like you talked about the conversation even trans. And it's like, you're not trying to be offensive. And I think a lot of women, it's uncomfortable if they did, unfortunately, accidentally go that route and would on a blood, if you actually analyze their blood and it was a chemical sex change, that would be horrifying. And I can imagine that if it was unintended, they didn't know what was going to happen. And then this happened. They don't want you to say, well, you're a man, because they're like, no, I'm not. But you're telling them that they are. And so I think there's that discomfort level too, because these conversations are uncomfortable.
I think the conversation is agree too, right? Like we're all human. Yeah, we're all born a certain way, male, female, and we all try to identify and coexist within this human existence. But if we stop trying to segregate too much, even though we are not equal, we all have our strengths and our individuality, we still are one species. You know what I mean? Like, why can't we just coexist as one human species as opposed to bringing up, bringing down? And maybe the conversations, maybe the questions would be better. You know what I mean? Maybe we'd be moving in a more positive direction of how to sustain and coexist in a healthier manner as one population, as opposed to a segregated idea.
So if I can try to summarize the whole point I'm making is, in my opinion, we are collectively as a tribe moving forward the discussion. Yeah. What should the strategy be? And I just, the reason that you just said then, it's uncomfortable. A lot of these things are uncomfortable conversations. And I've the person that's chosen to wade into the thick of it and start the conversation. I don't mean to cause offense to the transgender community, to anyone, but the reality is, as I said, these are very interesting subjects that if you're going to talk about the applications of androgens in females and you're worried about the deleterious effects or consequence of that, then you can't not have that conversation. It's disingenuous to not have that conversation at some point. You don't need to hyper to go onto the table so we can move forward. So yeah, I think all of these dialogues, all of these things are threads that each one of them, in their own right, you can grab and pull on, and each one becomes a podcast in its own right almost. You could talk for hours and hours and hours about all these things. I just happen to be the guy that's wanting to instigate the dialogue. I want to have the conversation about what we did historically was not based on clinical practice. It was based on bro science. That's true in terms of training, in terms of nutrition, in terms of supplementation, and in terms of enhancement. Over the last 15 years, we've moved a long way forward in these other areas, but this is the first time that we're moving the conversation forward in the area specifically of enhancement with regard of bringing forward clinical evidence to support arguments.
Victor, this was such an incredible conversation with you. I can't thank you enough for your time. And I think the audience, if they want to learn more from Victor, he is very, very, you put out some great content and great controversial topics on your Instagram, which is Prep Coach Academy. That's how they find you on Instagram. If you want to share where else they can find you, that would be wonderful.
Yeah. So I kind of unashamedly, like any small business, I have marketing content. I'm trying to tell people what we're all about. That really comes from doing podcasts like this, my own YouTube content, and my Instagram account, Victor Black Masterclass. The Prep Coach Academy material is really the material that I hold behind my paywall. Obviously, like many people that create intent, I have free content that I put out to raise awareness and to trigger conversations and to encourage engagement. And then I have paid materials that lie behind. So the reason I say that is if you go to Prep Coach Academy, you'll see it's kind of blocked off. That's for members, as it were. So in the first instance, what I would encourage guys to do is to go to my YouTube channel, which is Victor Black Masterclass. I have many different subjects, but similar format where we have a podcast with guests that I either have invited to come on the show or I've gone on their show. I would just say watch 3 or 4 or 5 hours worth of these conversations. And if these conversations interest you and inspire you, then understand that I have a paywall section as well, a members only area as well. Yeah.
And so the Instagram that is not the paid one is Victor Black Masterclass, correct?
Correct. Thank you.
Yes. But start on the YouTube first is Victor Black Masterclass on YouTube.
Yeah. Lots of great free content there on every aspect of enhancement practice.
Victor, what a great conversation. Listen, we're about to take this podcast on the road. We're jumping in a minivan, hitting literally this week. And awesome. We're traveling the country. We're going to be hitting many different gyms and setting up different podcasts with different people all around in what you're calling our tribe, and bodybuilding and fitness and music for me. Just a little hint. Anyway, hopefully, I'm just putting it out there. At some point, we're going to get our asses to Thailand.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Go to Thailand.
And when that day comes, oh my God, we got to hook up.
You guys let us know when you get up this way. I'm up in Chiang Mai. I don't know whether you know the geography of Thailand, but I'm right at the top.
Okay.
So if you get up to the mountains in Chiang Mai, you let me know, and I'll love to catch up.
Absolutely, absolutely. Can any base jumping or anything? Any big cliffs or anything like?
There's a lot of things to do whitewater. Right? There's no base jumping. There's some climbing, but it's. We don't have huge mountain ranges in Thailand. I'm sure you appreciate that. It's okay. Like we do have mountains. So it's basically whitewater rafting, and I'm very much into I don't know whether you know what enduro dirt bikes are, but
I love it.
The off-road dirt racing and stuff like that. So we'll get you out and have some fun. Yeah.
I just sprained my ankle thinking I was 15 again and jumped back into BMX biking. got into an argument with the orthopedic. She didn't want me to do anything for 6 weeks. I'm leg pressing 2 weeks later. So I have nothing but appreciation for extreme sports. The orthopedic
said, don't even go for a walk in the mall. And what did you do? You purposely walked around because she told you not to.
In flip-flops too. I had to make sure those muscles were active.
Nice. Awesome.
Well, thank you so much again, Victor Black. You are a wealth of knowledge, and thank you so much for your time. Once again, Victor Black Masterclass on YouTube and also on Instagram. And we will stay tuned.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Ever wonder if you are posing correctly for your division? Learn to Pose is dedicated to taking out the guesswork on how to pose for all categories in bodybuilding. Learn 5 ways you can improve your posing skills in 5 minutes guaranteed at www.learntopose.com. There are free posing tutorials available for the bikini, figure, and men's physique categories, and more on the way for other divisions in bodybuilding. It's free, so go access your free posing tutorial for bikini, figure, or men's physique at learntopose.com.